G'day everyone, welcome to the Bamboo History Podcast. I'm your host Stephen, and for those who are new, the Bamboo History Podcast is a podcast that focuses on Chinese history, with a splash of history of neighbouring East Asian countries. In last week's episode, we talked about the background behind the First Opium War and the events leading up to the conflict, including China's restriction of trade with the British, which led to the British trading opium illegally on China's shores, leading to an epic crackdown in 1839 when Chinese official Lin Zexu destroyed over 1,000 tons of opium in one go. The British opium merchants demanded that the British government do something, and the government decided that, to bring quote-unquote justice and uphold the principles of free trade, they would send an army to teach the Chinese a lesson. And that brings us to part 2 of this series on the First Opium War. And so now, let's get straight in to today's episode. After Lin Zexu destroyed the seized opium in June 1839, he ordered a naval blockade of the Pearl River to stop any Brits from entering the river from the South China Sea to trade. Tensions between the Chinese and the British further heightened in July 1839 when a group of sailors got drunk and beat a Chinese villager to death in Kowloon in present-day Hong Kong. Lin Zexu requested the British Trading Authority to hand over the culprits, but Charles Elliot, the chief superintendent of trade in China, said no, as he wanted the culprits to be punished under British law and not under Chinese law. Lin Zexu took this refusal as a disregard of Chinese sovereignty, and in August 1839 banned people from selling food to the British. The Chinese then brought in another naval blockade, believing that starving out the British would force them to hand over the culprits. Things were going to blow up sooner rather than later, and that happened on the 4th of September 1839. On this day, Elliot led a few ships to search for food supplies, but when they were stopped by a blockade of 3 Chinese ships, these ships refused to let them through and refused to give the British food and water supplies. So, Elliot ordered his ships to fire their cannons at the Chinese ships. The Chinese retaliated and fired back at the British. The Chinese forts on shore also fired at these British ships. Outnumbered and out of ammunition, the Brits retreated, and the Chinese stopped pursuing them after the British came back with reinforcements. This little skirmish ended in a stalemate, but it would mark the start of the First Opium War. Boom, boom. 2 months later, a little misunderstanding ended up becoming the second clash of the war. A British merchant ship had attempted to trade with the Chinese, but Elliot believed that the ship was not trading according to the rules of free trade. So, Elliot ordered the Navy to block the merchant ship from trading. But the Chinese Navy commander, Guan Tianpei, spelt Guantianpei, thought otherwise. He thought the British Navy was harassing the trading ship and decided to send some ships to investigate. Elliot thought these Chinese ships had come to attack them and fired at them. This then escalated into a battle, and this battle is known as the First Battle of Chunpi, spelt Chuenpi, which was fought on the Pearl River near Humen. The British warships were more agile and had stronger firepower and they quickly overwhelmed the Chinese ships, who retreated. In a year or so, by June 1840, more British reinforcements arrived. Their aim was clear. They wanted to assert dominance over the Chinese, get compensation for the opium that was destroyed, end China's restrictive trading policies, and to obtain an island off the Chinese coast that they could use for trading purposes. Lin Zexu had realised after the First Battle of Chuanpi that the British were far more superior than they were, and he himself assembled a large army near Canton and the Pearl River region and heavily fortified the coast. The Brits therefore did not confront the Chinese head on. Instead, the British turned their attention north towards areas not as fortified, and on July 1840 they reached the island of Zhoushan, spelt Zhoushan, off the coast of China's Zhejiang province. The British wanted to make Zhoushan as their new base, and at first tried to convince the local authorities to surrender peacefully to them. The local authorities obviously said, "No way, Jose," and the British were like, "Okay, have it your way," and bombarded the island with their ship cannons. The Chinese were overwhelmed by the cannon fire and retreated, and the British captured Zhoushan on the 5th of July 1840. At this point, the British hoped that they would use this show of force to let the Chinese government hear them out on their demands. They tried to do this in Ningbo, a port city near Zhoushan, but again their demands were left unanswered. The British then sent a part of their force north towards Beijing, hoping to put pressure on the central government directly, whilst the remainder of their force went back down south to the Pearl River. The Chinese ships, however, were just no match for the British, who defeated them again at the Battle of the Barrier in August 1840, near present-day Macau. To make things worse for the Chinese, Lin Zexu was sacked as the imperial commissioner by the Daoguang Emperor. Lin Zexu was hard done here. The losses against the British weren't his fault. The British Navy had bested the Chinese forces because of their superior technology and tactics. But the government needed a scapegoat, and Lin Zexu, being the leader, was exiled. He was replaced with Qi Shan, who was an ethnic Mongol nobleman and official. Qi Shan is spelt Qishan. Admiral Elliot was ordered by his higher-ups to negotiate with the Chinese for them to open up all their trading ports to the British and to cede them at least one island for the British to conduct their trading activities. This was in addition to compensation money for the opium destroyed. Qi Shan rejected the offer, and when a deal just could not be negotiated, Elliot again mounted an attack. In January 1841, the British and Chinese clashed again at Humen, this battle becoming known as the Second Battle of Chuanpi. The British won the battle in just an hour, with over 500 Chinese casualties and only 38 British casualties. Qi Shan was blown away by the strength of the British, and on the 20th of January 1841, the Convention of Chuanpi was signed. And some of the conditions in this convention were giving Hong Kong Island to the British, payment of £6 million to the British, direct and equal ties between the two nations, and opening up Canton for trade. In exchange, the British returned Zhoushan and the captured forts at Humen during their battle back to the Chinese. Qi Shan had made this deal without the emperor's approval. So when the Daoguang Emperor found out, Qi Shan was denounced and removed as Imperial Commissioner. Surprisingly, Admiral Elliot was also removed from his post by his superior, Lord Palmerston, because he had acquired so little from the Chinese from this battle. So little. I mean, you got an island and £6 million. Come on, is that not enough for you? Anyway, it was clear then that the battle was far from over. The British were not happy with this deal, and the Chinese wanted their land back. So the fighting continued, and later in the year, in August 1841, the British captured the coastal city of Amoy, now known as Xiamen, and then retook Zhoushan Island soon after. Then, the British continued north and captured Shanghai in June 1842. The final battle of the First Opium War was the Battle of Zhenjiang, which took place on the 21st of July 1842. Faced with 7,000 British troops, the 3,000 or so Chinese defenders fought bravely, but the Brits still won and captured Zhenjiang in just a day. With Zhenjiang in British hands, the city of Nanjing was exposed. Nanjing was one of the largest cities in southern China and was an important transport hub. If the British captured this city, it would be a big blow to the Qing Empire. Hence, the Daoguang Emperor decided to sue for peace, and this was when the famous, or infamous, Treaty of Nanking was signed. On the 29th of August 1842, the Treaty of Nanking, the Nanjing Tiaoyue, was signed. Under the treaty, the following things were to happen. 1. The Chinese had to open treaty ports at Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai to all traders. 2. The Chinese had to pay the British 20 million in silver as compensation for their suffering. 3. The Kohong Gonghang system in Canton was to be abolished. And 4. Perhaps the condition that has had the most impact in modern China, and that is the cessation of Hong Kong Island to the British in perpetuity. This means the British weren't just leasing Hong Kong Island from the Chinese. The Chinese had given it to them to keep forever. You can see here that all these conditions under the treaty are heavily favoured towards one side, the British. If the Chinese weren't giving out money, then they were giving away land. It was clearly an unequal treaty. The First Opium War was the first major conflict between Qing China and Britain in history. The immediate impact for China was that they lost Hong Kong Island to the British, and their military was dealt a big blow. The long-term impact was that the war exposed the Qing Empire's vulnerabilities. The empire had once been known as the most powerful in the world. Now, everyone knew that they were no match against the British, and this would undermine the Qing government's authority, eroding their grip over China over time. For the British, of course, it was just another step towards their own quest of world dominance, and of course access to their beloved tea. You must all be wondering now, what are Stephen's thoughts about this war? Growing up in a Chinese household, the sentiment that I got was that it was a humiliating defeat and what caused China to collapse and begin its so-called century of humiliation, which was 100 years of war, chaos, and decline that brought China to its knees. Lin Zexu, however, is one of the few bright spots, and he's celebrated as a hero for curbing opium trade amongst the Chinese people. But some people believe that his methods were too extreme. I also believe that his hard-handed approach of destroying all the opium in one go was the final nail in the coffin that led to the British choosing violence. If he had been a bit more diplomatic in his approach, or less extreme in the destruction of opium, then perhaps the British may have taken a more peaceful approach. Through my research, I also believe that the British were not just mindlessly wanting to attack China. For them, wealth and resources came first. They knew it wasn't a good idea to pick on an empire as large as China's, no matter how technologically superior they were. And they only did so because they were provoked and backed to a corner by restrictive trade policies. But amongst all the discussions of how the British wanted to uphold, free trade and all that, were they right in attacking the Chinese? Of course not. You are a guest in a foreign country. You have to abide by their rules, no matter how restrictive they may be. If China doesn't want to trade with you, then China doesn't want to trade with you. That's not an excuse for you to, uphold rules of free trade and all that, and then attack that country, right? It's like if a salesperson came over to your house and wanted you to buy something, but you said no because you didn't want to, and then they got angry and started egging your house. I mean, it's obviously their fault for egging your house. It's the same situation here. The reason why the British won was largely because their technology was way more advanced than the Chinese. Let's talk about a few examples. First, their ships were outright superior and was the deciding factor in this war. The British ships were ironclad. The Chinese ships were wooden ships. Now, if I was a cannonball, it's easier for me to penetrate wood as opposed to iron. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, the British ships were steam engine powered. The Chinese ships still used sails. Hence, the British ships were faster and more agile. Second, their soldiers were more experienced. Thanks to Britain's aggressive expansion, a lot of their soldiers had been fighting battles in places like India and Africa. China, by then, was a large peaceful empire, and for decades no major battles had happened. This meant then that soldiers lacked experience, discipline, and most likely used weapons that their grandfather had passed on to them. Third, the British had better strategy. They came with an intent to fight the Chinese and planned ahead. They knew attacking the Chinese head first on land was not a good idea. They'd be overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of Chinese infantry as well as its cavalry. Instead, they used their superior ships to their advantage. Their wins pretty much came from just positioning their ships just out of range of the Chinese cannons. Then, they bombed the coastal forts with their cannons, which had longer range. Then, when they blew up the fortifications to smithereens, the soldiers would then land and finish the job. The Chinese, on the other hand, were absolutely clueless most of the time. For example, by the time Chinese horseback messengers rode from a coastal city being attacked by the British all the way to Beijing to get instructions from the emperor and then riding back with those instructions, the British had already ransacked that city, had already left and sailed their ship elsewhere to attack another place. And you know what? It's all thanks to how fast the British ships were. By the time the messengers came back, they were long gone. They were just simply too fast for the Chinese. We can't discredit the Chinese soldiers though. They fought bravely against the British, despite being no match for them. Case in point was Guan Tianpei and 400 of his men, who, on the 26th of February 1841, all fought valiantly despite being splattered by cannon fire, and all refused to retreat, with Guan and all of his men dying a hero's death to protect their nation. On the other hand, the emperor along with many of the country's top-ranking officials, made foolish decisions which led to China losing the war. They were blinded with arrogance that they were the most powerful country in the world and failed to take Britain seriously. All I can say to that is, the loss suffered by the Chinese in the First Opium War was a brutal wake-up call for them, and for all of China. So yeah, that's it. That's the end of a long two-part series of the First Opium War, or the 第一次鸦片战争. It's such a depressing topic, but I hope all of you learnt something new. Quick reminder again to follow my podcast and channel, check out my Instagram, and visit my website. I've also got TikTok too as well now. So please check them all out. I'll leave all the details, including my contact details, in the description box below. Feel free to message me, email me with any feedback, general comments, or topic suggestions. Okay, it's time to go and smoke opium. Oh, sorry, what? Huh? I'm just kidding, kids. Don't do drugs. Anyway, thanks everyone for listening. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening, and I'll see you all next time on the Bamboo History Podcast. Bye for now.